Hello, I'm Brian Anderson, the Reverend Brian Anderson. I'm the Superintendent Minister of East Belfast Mission, and I happen to be here at a very significant time where this mission is celebrating 40 years of being East Belfast Mission, but also acknowledging 200 years of Methodism on the Newtonard Road and in East Belfast. So we thought about putting together a series of podcasts entitled Then and Now, 200 Years Later. And our dream is that this podcast will look at various aspects of the life of East Belfast Mission. And in doing so, we hope draw out some points about how church grows, how church connects with communities, and how we meet the needs that are presented before us. I'm joined today by our current Chief Executive Officer, the Reverend Andrew Irvine, who's come to help me discuss today around really the origins and where East Belfast Mission grew from and the kind of uh, earth that our church was built on and the community that was around it. So, Andrew, you're very welcome.
It's good to be here, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you. Tell us a little bit about your role.
I first actually came to the mission as a board member, not as a member of staff, in 2014. One of your predecessors, the Reverend Margaret Ferguson, who is the Salvation Army, would say he's been promoted since.
Yeah, we miss her.
And a great loss to us. But Margaret invited me at that stage to come onto the board of the mission. And I spent a happy 18 months as a trustee. And the director at that stage, Anne, was moving on. And Margaret had said to me, I think God wants you to apply for the job.
Right.
And I said, well, he hasn't told me yet, Margaret. With a bit of a conversation about that, but obviously, as I'm sitting here 9 years later in the chief executive's chair, that's what happened. I'm leaving actually in January to move on, but it's been 9 years of just a huge privilege.
So my role is to act as chair of the board and look after the congregation and run one of the projects. Your role is different and more embracive of all the mission, Andrew.
Yes, so well, I am a part-time Methodist minister. Mostly, I'm not clergy at EBM. That's not my role here. It is a chief executive of a charity. As the chief executive would operate in any secular charity, we've around 100 paid staff. That number moves up and down slightly from week to week, but around 100 paid staff, some 150 volunteers working across very diverse projects, which no doubt we'll talk about here, from homelessness to employability to meeting the needs of people who are living in poverty or destitute in the community, through to actually the largest Irish language learning centre on the island of Ireland, which, bear in mind, we're in a PUL communities, and interesting.
So a good dynamic.
Good dynamic, because we're very involved in reconciliation work. So being what a chief executive does, leading up the staff team in a sense, reporting to the board, endeavouring to make sure that, along with my colleagues, we deliver the board's vision.
And our vision currently is to provide love, hope, and leadership in East Belfast.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I love the fact that we got love in the title.
In the title.
In our you could have put life or you could have put encouragement, but I think a church expressing itself with the word love is lovely.
It is, and there are just so many aspects of this community where hope is needed.
Yeah.
And that we exist to bring that hope and to love people while we do it, and to partner with other organisations, community organisations in East Belfast, and for us to be able to provide some sort of leadership into that as we work in partnership with others is just wonderful.
Okay. Andrew, let's go back into our memories and think back to the sort of 1800s, and Methodism was established. The first congregation was in 1816, I understand, but the first building, the first church physically built on the Newtonard Road was in 1826, hence why in 2026 it'll be 200 years of Methodism, but it's slightly longer than that, but we'll not get caught up in exact dates. Methodism established itself very strongly. There was Pitt Street, there was in Pottinger Methodist, there was then the discovery of a need for a church on the Newtonard Road. But the culture was very different then to how we see culture now. For instance, people have 3-year contracts for their jobs, or maybe they've signed a contract for their job. It's very different in those days, wasn't it?
Well, it was, and it's at a point in history in terms of the industrialization of Belfast, which wasn't a city until 1888.
Mm.
So in 1700, there were 2,500 people living in the town of Belfast.
Right.
2,500. By 1800, there are 25,000 people. So this industrialization's happening, and people are moving in from more rural parts of Ulster and beyond to get jobs in these industries in Belfast. And Belfast would, by the end of the 1800s, be probably the fourth largest industrial hub in Europe.
Right.
I mean, it's quite an amazing story.
Absolutely.
But as people move in to take jobs in that, it's not the employment market that we imagine today. So it's this idea of going down and standing at, whether it's the rope works, the shipyard, or indeed on our site before the church was built, there was a bottle making factory, which is why if you come into our church sanctuary here, there's the little round coloured discs in the windows that tells the story of that old bottle making factory. But people would have showed up and, at the worst case scenario, got a job for a day,
Mm-hmm.
maybe got signed on for a week. So it was very temporary, very casual, and that led to poverty issues back then that you as the minister now are still dealing with 200 years later.
And equally, we're dealing with employment issues 200 years later.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And as people settled, and faith in those days was much more part of life and an intrinsic part of your whole DNA. Society has changed significantly now. Faith seems to be less important for folks. But in those days, literally, and still have the evidence of that, there was a church in every street corner,
Yeah, absolutely.
and most of them were filled. So one of the key preachers in those times was W.B. Nicholson. And, he was a great orator, and the stories go that the men left the shipyard and then just piled out and filled the churches to hear W.P. Nicholson. And there was a lot of what we would call conversions to Christianity, and people saw that faith very much part of who they were. An important part of life was the expression of faith.
It was, and quite often those preachers back then, as the church played a more central role, would have been the people who brought other news.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have went maybe to hear whoever was speaking, to hear what was going on in the wider city or even the wider
Yes,
world.
yes.
They didn't have access to all the technology that brings us news across the world so quickly. So those speakers would have been not only, sharing a Christian or a gospel message, but that have been bringing other news.
Yes.
So is your source of news, amongst other things. But the Methodists, of course, from, the sort of first third of the 1700s in England, were really a protest movement within the Church of England.
Mhm.
And that protest was centered around the church not doing enough to help those who were poor or living in some sort of destitution. And the Wesley brothers and their friends at Oxford University were very determined to get into the towns and meet people and help people practically. And it's not too far from the foundations of Methodism that these Methodists are meeting on the Newton Ards Road. And they would have had that early Methodist DNA around social justice.
Mhm.
And in this burgeoning industrial town where actually there's poverty and strife in the middle of it all, they brought a practical faith.
Yes.
The Bible in one hand and newspaper in the other.
And I think one of the first expressions of that was a soup kitchen.
Yes.
So coming out of the end of the First World War, there was a high degree of poverty. And Newton Ards Road Methodism was one of the first ones to say, well, look, we need to respond to this. We want to keep preaching the gospel. We want people to hear the good news of Jesus Christ. But we also can't let them go back on the street or their bellies are empty.
Absolutely.
And so they thought of a soup kitchen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think we had 4 typical church buildings, 4 skenos.
Mhm.
I think in this community today, most people remember the last church building, which
Yeah.
went up in 1952.
Yeah.
And that had a cafe in it. That soup kitchen carried on
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
continued to provide food.
Yeah. But one of the significant moments was the Luftwaffe coming to hit Harna Wolf shipyard and missing and destroyed the church that was the third iteration, isn't that right?
That's right. So it's about 1932, that building.
Yeah, and then it was destroyed in 1941.
That's right. Belfast Blitz.
And I have members in my congregation who still talk about standing on the rubble.
Wow.
You know, older ladies in their 90s now. I can think of Mary. Mary that I remember vividly standing at my church. And there's a passion and a sadness, but you could feel the desire that this was not going to destroy her faith. She was going to see this rebuilt again.
Rebuild.
And, you know, she talks with fondness standing on the rubble, but also you could see the likes of Mary, and there was many, many like her. Was determined that the New Norwich Road Methodist Church rebuilt again and would be on site and ready to share that love and compassion again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it took over a decade to do that.
It did.
But they
It
stuck
did.
with it.
Methodism doesn't Methodism doesn't move quickly in these matters, sure it doesn't.
Yeah, but it's solid and it stays the
course.
It
Yeah,
stays
300 years. 200 years.
Actually, I got a tour of the Oval, and it's fascinating to hear the story of that raid from the Oval's point of view, because apparently the German pilots, who were flying very low, 500 feet, heading towards the docks, and they were actually trying to hit what they thought was a reservoir,
Right?
but was actually the Oval's football pitch.
Wow.
But at night in the dark, they thought it was a reservoir, and they dropped a stick of bombs clean diagonally across the pitch.
Right.
And if you go down today, the little pillbox where there'd been anti-aircraft guns is still by the corner flag in the Oval today.
Oh, right. Yeah. Brilliant. Those stories are so important to capture them, aren't they? Because part of the history.
Part of the community we're in.
Absolutely. Let's move a little bit forward now in terms of the origins and the DNA to the sort of establishment of moving from Newton Ards Road Methodist to become an East Belfast Mission in 1985. I was looking through some of the old leaders' meetings notes, Andrew, and in 1975, so 10 years before Newton Ards Road Methodist became EBM, I was reading through, and they were having a strong debate in the meeting around setting up a development of a community drop-in.
Okay.
And you could, from the way it's noted, you could tell there was a group of people who said, no, gotta keep preaching the gospel. Gotta get them into the church on a Sunday and let them hear the gospel on a Sunday morning, Sunday night, and that's where our priority should be. And there was others in the room saying yes to that, but that doesn't mean we can't build a community centre as well, and I'll have a drop-in for soup kitchen, for young people to drop into, for children to drop into with their parents. And they decided not to open it. That was their decision.
That was mid-70s.
That was the mid-70s. But you could tell there was a dilemma. While the majority, there has to be a vote and has to be a decision, and they decided not to. But within 10 years, something has significantly changed. And I wondered, is part of that the arrival of the Reverend Jim Ray? Jim,
He's a huge figure in the story.
absolutely.
I arrived in Newton Ards Road as a young man in Portview Trade Centre, which is, a 5-minute walk from here, working in the landlord's office in the early 90s, and Jim was still a mission superintendent. I think he was mission superintendent for more than 20 years.
Well, he tells a good story about that, because he was in Newton Ards Road Methodist Church for 7 years. And our rules at that point were he had then to move the following year. But they knew they needed to keep Jim for the continuity to transform into what Methodism called a mission.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to that in a wee second. And there wasn't forward notice given to a motion for the conference. But a man called Sam McGuffin from Sydenham Methodist Church scribbled some notes on the back of a bit of paper, got up and told the conference, like, you've got to let rules be rules and you've got to hear by them, but you've also got to be flexible with them. And he managed to convince the conference to let Jim stay.
We're all glad he did.
Absolutely. And it's just that lovely sense of, somebody seeing a bigger picture.
Yeah.
And God's will being worked out. not despite the rules, but being creative around the rules,
Absolutely.
you know.
So, I mean, my memory of him in those days is he would have called in to Portview to see my boss.
Right. Portview being
So it was
a mill.
spinning mill from
Right.
the 1800s became a trade centre.
Right.
So it really was an early form in the 1980s of business incubation units. So the offices and the industrial units in it have been quite small, and they were really starter units for people.
Right.
But when he came in, at that point, the mission had started a job club
Right.
called Stepping Stones,
Uh-huh.
and it's in where the old offices of the mission opposite Skenos,
Yeah.
or been opposite the old church.
Yes.
And it was a job club on the ground floor, and he was coming in and basically telling my boss he was going to have somebody, he was going to take an employee. I don't
Okay.
think there was much of a choice.
And what was your role at that point, Andrew?
I was junior office guy in the office.
Right, okay.
So normally I was the one, depending on how flexible Tom was with his time that day, trying to fend off
Right.
the Reverend Ray or make sure he got into the office. But when Jim came in, he was a man on a mission, so to speak. Excuse the pun.
No, no.
But and we did have some people then working for the property company.
Right.
I don't think Tom, my boss, had much choice in the matter.
Let's come back to this notion of transforming from a Methodist church to being and having what Methodism calls mission status. So at that point, there would have been Dublin Central Mission, what would have been known then as Londonderry Mission, and Belfast Central Mission, along with Newton Abbey, which was a slightly smaller development. And then the idea was, well, how do we transform Newton Ards Road Methodism into East Belfast Mission? What are missions in Methodism, Andrew?
So this is where the church is more directly involved in what many today might call community services.
Yeah.
So there's a legal entity then formed, a form of governance put around it, which allows the mission to engage in grant taking, fundraising activities at a whole other scale than a single church congregation could manage. So today, what that's turned into is a major charity turning over just shy of 4 million a year.
Right.
A church congregation would find that very difficult to cope with.
Yeah.
And so East Belfast Mission is a limited company by guarantee, which means it's not for profit. And it's a registered charity in its own right with the Charity Commission for Northern Ireland. So it allows a church congregation to be at the heart of a bigger entity, which is able to engage in the delivery of substantial community services. I think that's probably
that's very helpful. It's very helpful. But and that legal entity is important, and that sense of doing it right is so important, and especially now with charity commission rules, etc., which wasn't around then, but as now. But there's stories around the people who are the catalyst for that. And Jim Ray was telling me a story about a guy called Tommy Coy.
Okay.
Tommy Coy was an alcoholic. His life was just drifting away on him. And he had a chance encounter with Jim. And Jim said, like, Tommy, what's going on here? And, chatted with him, got alongside him, tried to help him, and did, and was successful. And Jim had an interest in helping people out of addictions. And he helped Tommy out of this addiction. And Tommy then came along and said, well, look, I want to work in your day center. I want to give something back. I want to make sure that what I went through, that lived experience piece that we often talk about, that lived experience of saying, look, I've been here. I know what it is. I can help people. And that came around in 1984, just a year before the decision makers were making the decision around, becoming East Belfast Mission. So there was that sort of work going on in the background of Methodism, but you've also the likes of Tommy Coy, who came along, and that helped. I believe that helped the congregation and the leadership of the congregation say, actually, you know what? We can't, as you say, the church congregation, we can't do this. We need the likes of Tommy Coy to come around and say, look, here's what I've been through, and you don't want to let your community suffer from addictions. And so let me try and come in and try and do it.
it gave the church and the leadership in the church a very clear example,
Absolutely.
of what this work would involve.
Absolutely. You're so right. And then there's another guy called David Elliott, another alcoholic. And David Elliott was addicted to alcohol. He lost his home and came encounter with Jim and a couple of other people from the mission. And they had this community center, as I say, and on the top story there was this little sort of wee sort of bunker room. And so Jim and a couple of others hid him up there.
Okay.
And the congregation, the leaders board didn't know anything about it. If there was another board, they didn't know nothing about it, but they hid Billy in there. And Billy was really good. Billy gave it away because Billy wouldn't sneak downstairs at night and clean the floor.
Right. So every time they come in, the one's place was spotless.
Who's cleaned this floor? So they had to tell them what had happened. But again, another example of how a bit of flexibility around the rules allowed things to happen and change. And we just last week buried a lady called Meta Halliday.
Yeah.
When Meta Halliday's mum died, Mrs. McGaw died, Meta's family came to Jim and said, here's this house. All the other houses on the row, or the vast majority of them, are blocked up, but this one's not. Do you know anybody could live there? Billy Elliott.
Yeah.
You know? So, or sorry, not Billy Elliott, I'm getting caught away. Davy Elliott.
David. Yeah.
Davy Elliott. He got the house.
He got the house. That was his first Hosford home, in a sense.
Well, he
We'll
was
go into that, but
he was a precursor
Precursor to that,
to
yeah.
all that there. So, do you know, my sense is they played by the rules, but if they had to be flexible for the sake of people, not for the sake of bending the rules,
Yeah.
but for the sake of people, they were prepared to do it.
Well, as you know, I've had a bit of involvement with the Air Force over time. I had a boss in the Air Force used to say that rules were for the guidance of the wise and the blind obedience of fools.
Right.
With his line on it.
Okay.
And I think that's fair enough, actually. Yeah.
And
A good example.
and Davy Elliott's story, when they obviously these were housing executive houses, and the housing officer came to Jim and says, Jim, you can't just put someone in the house. Well, Jim said back, well, they're all blocked up or else they're empty. So what, am I not putting someone in my house? But I went on and went on and on. And Jim tells a great story about going to see the housing manager for East Belfast. And he took this lady called Molly Taylor with her. He knew Molly was feisty, but she was also toothless.
Oh, right.
And between Jim and Molly, they convinced the house officer that Davy Elliott would stay in the house.
Yes, that's great. Absolutely fantastic.
So those are just,
The early stories.
the early stories of
I
people
was
making a
up at,
difference.
I was invited to speak up at Dundonald Elam
Uh-huh.
about 18 months ago. And there was an elderly man who was doing the door.
Right.
And I was on the way out, and he was very gracious and said in and enjoyed what I'd had to say. And then he said, I opened your first shop.
Right.
So this man had opened the first little clothes shop. And of course, when I have seven shops called Restore, but this was the first little shop opposite Portview Trade Centre, 235, I think it is, on Large Road. And I said to him, well, what was your turnover in the first year?
Uh-huh.
And he said, well, from what I remember, we did about 15,000. And I was able to share with him that there were now 7 stores.
Right.
Yeah. Turning over $750,000 or
Yes.
whatever. And all of that money was going to help poverty and people who were genuinely destitute today. So it's, it's out of these small acorns.
Yeah.
From that period of the mission's history that, as various chapters of the story have gone on and the story has expanded, have turned into great things.
Absolutely. But you need that combination of story of, the stories of things that are people's lives being transformed, those sort of cultural stories to go alongside the legalities and doing things to ensure things to happen. So, Andrew, let's move on in the conversation and think around. So that's the genesis of East Belfast Mission, and we'll look at individual projects on these podcasts over the future weeks. What for you as outgoing CEO, hearing those stories, hearing that legacy, what for you is the transformation that was brought to East Belfast?
Well, I look at the last 9 years and see how those projects have continued to transform. So if we take the homelessness project and going from Dave Elliott's story in that first house,
Mhm.
when I arrived here, we had one property in um, Townsend Street, and I remember being taken down, and there was a gentleman living in it. When I looked at it, I was just shocked at the poor order of the house, to the extent where I had said, "Look, nobody should be living like that. We need to get another home for this gentleman, and we're going to work out, well, can we afford to refurbish that, or is it better to sell it?" And then, in fact, we sold the house. Um, so at that stage in 2017, that would have been, the homelessness service was really down to two elements. One was the emergency accommodation, the 26-bed hostel that we have here as part of Skenos.
Mhm.
And we had a homelessness prevention team of 4 full-time staff, which is now 5 full-time staff who are actually preventing homelessness in East Belfast. But it's great that over those 9 years, we've been able to take the community home project and re-establishing it on a much, much better footing. So today we have 18 housing units,
Yes.
some of them 3-bedroom homes, some of them single-bed apartments. Um, and those are at a standard where, honestly, if, Margaret, my wife, and I landed
Mhm.
in some city on a city break in an Airbnb and got one of those homes, I'd be absolutely ecstatic with it. I would think we had
Well, so
landed
good.
well.
Yeah.
They're of really good quality. I'd be more than happy to live in any one of them myself. And for us to have seen that project develop on,
Mhm.
uh, and we've recently had a business case signed off with the Department for Communities, who are going to give us what's called financial transaction capital. It's basically a very soft loan from government that'll be repaid over 25 years. It's potentially going to allow us to do another 9 homes.
Great.
So just seeing where maybe 9 years ago we were having to strip things back,
Yes.
we were having to make sure that the foundations of things were right,
Yes.
to at a stage now where there is growth and things are flourishing and the projects are growing.
Yes.
Back then, the Irish language program, Turas, which is the Irish word for going on a journey, was the idea is to take a community on a journey. I would want to say a journey back in time, because actually Irish was spoken on the Newton Ards Road in the day.
There you go.
And I remember one elderly lady back about 2018 stopped me outside the mission. And she was remembering back to her childhood, so probably remembering back to the early 50s. And at that point in the early 50s, her grandmother, who was an elderly lady at that stage, was living in Shadawley Street and was an Irish speaker. And then I started to get the stories of the streets, like Bryson Street, named after Samuel Bryson, a pharmacist in 1895.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was a Presbyterian. And along with another Presbyterian who happened to be the Grand Master of the Orange Order in
Right.
Belfast,
Okay.
and one Anglican, formed the Gaelic League for the protection of the language.
Right.
So Turris is actually about a journey back in time almost, to
Yes.
rediscover the roots of the community.
Yes.
But there were 200 people coming and learning Irish in the mission at that point. But here, 9 years later, we've 800 learners.
Yeah.
And actually
Amazing.
a school, a
Amazing.
primary school, has spurned off it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I take away is foundations being underpinned, and that has allowed now a safe growth,
Yeah.
a,
Yeah.
a growth
Yeah.
on a firm foundation. It's not rickety, and the new CEO coming in, Colin Hayburn, I think, I sound like a used car salesman here, but I'm presenting him with something that's
Yeah.
polished,
Yeah.
clean's got a
Yeah.
tank full of petrol, and hopefully he'll enjoy driving.
There's two other questions I'd like to ask you about. The first is this: what are some of the obstacles, potential obstacles, Andrew, that face EBM?
I don't actually think that faith dimension that you're talking about is one of them.
Yeah.
The community is becoming more secular, but actually, by the very nature of the form of Christianity that East Belfast Mission's involved in, which is a very practical faith, which does give people hope and does love and does provide
Yeah.
leadership, which is appreciated. I don't think that's an issue. I think people who maybe are not particularly open to faith nonetheless appreciate the work of the mission. So I think probably I would say the macroeconomic picture for the British government and the Northern Ireland government is a huge challenge. So if we were in England, a lot of these services that the mission deliver
Yes.
are actually delivered by the local authority or unitary authorities in England. Northern Ireland's quite unique in that it's got this very large community sector, which does so much work on behalf of the public sector. We have fantastic civil servants, so this is not a comment
Yes.
on the Northern Ireland Civil Service. We're very passionate people. They're trying to do what they can, but their resources are becoming more and more limited. So if we take the example of the employability project, before Brexit, there was £52 million every year coming into Northern Ireland to help people who were the furthest from the job market. 52 million. The year after Brexit, that halved to 26 million.
Right.
It looks like in this incoming year, it'll be down to 13 million.
Gosh.
And yet, we're talking about something which the UK government has identified economic inactivity as one of its key barriers to economic growth, something that is absolutely core to British government policy. And yet we've gone from 52 million
Wow.
to 13 million. So I think the challenge will be, how does the mission continue to grow its own unrestricted income, whether that's growing our social economy businesses like the restore shops, increasing the profitability of our community cafe, and not being ashamed, but being able to explain to people why we actually need to make that
Yes.
money.
Yes.
Because we are handing out thousands and thousands of pounds of food every week, and etc. That economic piece, particularly the public sector purse, I think in the context of Northern Ireland's model of delivering public services through community organisations, that's a big system challenge in Northern Ireland, and EBM sits within that systemic challenge.
And you've been in the foreground of challenging Westminster and Stormont around their commitment to our sector, given how it's delivered in Northern Ireland. Do you see a problem for the sort of third sector that we are, the community sector, the faith sector? Is there going to be challenges in Northern Ireland for it, do you think?
I think there is, for those organisations that aren't prepared to accept that the public purse is going to continue to diminish, and I think it will. We hear some of our politicians constantly demanding more from London. London hasn't got it to give.
Yeah.
5 of the largest unitary authorities in the UK are bankrupt.
Wow.
Birmingham, England's second largest city, is bankrupt.
Gosh.
So the money just isn't there. And I think the challenge will be for those organisations that can face that fact and think, well, where else and how else
Yeah.
are we going to actually fund
Yeah.
our community work going forward? And whether that's social economy business or whether it's actually working on fundraising around individual givers. So organisations like East Belfast Mission, building those core of people who have, and actually society is, at the same time, many are becoming poorer, many are becoming richer. It is a society of the haves and the have-nots. So it's about organisations like East Belfast Mission connecting with those who have and convincing them that they should be giving something out of that, and then generously giving out of that on an ongoing monthly basis to organisations like the Mission, but also legacy work and so that whole unrestricted fundraising.
And doesn't Belfast have a history of that kind of individual philanthropic giving?
Well, it does. It's a very good point. And the motto of the city, "Pro tanto quid retribamus," taken from Psalm 116, verse 12, translated, "For all we have received, what shall we give?"
Lovely.
So going back to 1888, Queen Victoria arrives, gives us city status. The Belfast Corporation, as it was, needs to come up with a crest and a motto, and they settle on, "For all that we have received, what shall we give?" And of course, the politicians in those days would have also been the industrialists, so they were wealthy people,
Yes.
and they gave to the building of a city.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's
Good.
harness pro tanto quid ret rebamus.
Indeed. Don't ask me to say that. I'll probably not say it as well as you do. Last question for you. We've sort of very quickly scanned over 200 years of a faith community trying to meet the community's needs. Um, and there's similarities in the 200 years journey. Um, and we've proven that we're going to stay here and we've been part of that. Uh, so the question would be, what next, or what do we keep on doing to help this PUL community develop and be a thriving community?
One of the things I think we need to do is to help the community articulate their needs. So, for example, we have local families who have been here for generations, who are now finding it very hard for the next generation to get a home, a social housing in this community.
Yes.
That's simply because there are 73,000 people on a homeless waiting list in Northern Ireland today, 50,000 families. There are not enough social houses to go around. Right. I have some thoughts around
Mhm.
the Northern Ireland Assembly needing, and the executive needing to bite the bullet and start to income generate themselves. I get free prescriptions.
Mm,
I get free water. I don't need
mm,
free prescriptions,
mm.
and I don't need free water, and I'd be happy to pay for it if it helped,
Yeah.
connect more houses to water, because
Yeah.
actually the inability to connect
There's
houses
a
to water
infrastructure problem.
is an infrastructure problem. But look, to cut to the point of this community, lack of social housing, those families who have been here for 4, 5, 6 generations, the latest generation can't get a home. And at times then the target of the frustration becomes someone or a family who have moved in from outside Northern Ireland. And actually they are not a legitimate target for that at all, because those families coming in from outside Northern Ireland, or that individual, faces the exact same system for the allocation of houses as locals do. There is no, you know, foreigners get first.
Yes.
That's not true.
No.
The system works the same for
Yes.
everybody, and it is a
Indeed.
fair system.
Indeed.
But that doesn't mean to say that the locals don't have a genuine issue.
Mm-hmm.
There is a genuine issue. If a family have lived in this community for 5 or 6 generations, and now the latest generation can't get a home here, that's a genuine problem. So maybe going forward, one of the things for the mission is becoming a voice, an advocate for the local community, but maybe helping those arguments to be articulated in a way which resonates with policymakers.
Yes. And also but equally challenging the community about some of the myths that they allow to develop, i.e., the immigrants are taking our homes. Well, they're not. There's a shortage of housing and development of housing. So I think there's a two-way street on that
There is.
conversation,
There is.
Andrew.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Brian. Enjoyed it.
Thank you
You.
for your input, and we obviously wish you well in your new role in the city centre chaplaincy.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today, and thank you for all you've given to East Belfast
It's
Mission.
been an absolute privilege, and enjoy working with you, Brian, if I may say. So thank you.
Thank you for those who've been watching and listening to this, and we'll be back again soon with the next stage of our podcast of 200 Years Then and Now.